button, so you might get a little pop-up. Welcome to those of you now joining us on YouTube as well. On the TCF side of things, we want to thank Itasca Bank for sponsoring this webinar. Sponsors like Itasca Bank help us to keep these webinars free for everybody. Contact me for more information if you are interested in sponsoring. You can also help us to keep these webinars free. After the webinar, you're going to be taken to a page with a bunch of resources of things you might be interested in, such as our native plant guide, rain barrel information, all this great information that we've got available for homeowners out there. But also including our virtual tip jar. So if you're enjoying these webinars, I do encourage you to donate to help TCF continue to do all the really awesome stuff that we do, because we do so much more than just webinars. We do an incredible amount of stuff. It's pretty cool. So you can also check the little box to become a member, and then you can enjoy a wide variety of members only stuff as well. Hey, as I mentioned, we do these webinars every week. So upcoming next week, I am super excited. We're bringing in Chris Benda, the Illinois botanizer, who is going to talk about the hidden natural treasures of Illinois. So he's going to talk about all the really cool stuff around the state that you may or may not have heard of before. So I'm really, really looking forward to that one. So please definitely check that one out. On March 10th, we're bringing back our friend Bill Bedrosian from Bedrock Earthscapes, and he's going to be talking about stormwater management, ponds, and naturalizing areas around ponds. So if you live in a homeowners association, something along those lines, and you have a pond that you have to take care of, definitely check that one out, because everybody's got a pond and nobody seems to know how to take care of them. So Bill will talk to us about that. It's going to be really awesome. He is super, super knowledgeable and a great guy. On March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, we will have Amanda Arnold back, our friend from Planet Landscapes, who's going to be talking about planting your rain garden. So thinking spring, getting ready for our spring planting. I know I'm itching to get back out in my yard again. So if you are thinking about planting a rain garden, definitely check us out on March 17th. And Amanda will tell us more about that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my very good friend, Amy Coffman, who is going to tell us all about the very fascinating world of biomimicry.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. I will go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Start it. Look good? Everybody can see it?
Yep, you're good.
There we go. All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to go learn about something that for some of you is going to be brand new, and for other of you will hopefully be a nice introduction to, or not even an introduction, like a refresher, and get to know a little bit more about something that you and are interested in. A long time ago, I used to do this talk called Bio What, because most people, when they hear biomimicry, they're not quite sure what that all entails. But the main thing that I want you to walk away with and to learn and to remember is that we're here to learn from nature. So not so much about learning about nature like we learned in school, but learning from nature as a mentor on how we can solve some critical challenges that we're facing today. Again, my name is Amy Kaufman Phillips. I am the Youth Programs Manager at the Conservation Foundation, and I also run a local network called Biomimicry Chicago, which is an organization that is there to educate and advocate on the field of biomimicry. So I'll ask some questions, we'll give you some examples, and then hopefully I will be able to inspire you and maybe give you some tools that you can start applying some of these ideas to your everyday life. So, as I mentioned, we're here to learn from nature to solve critical challenges, and I don't need to tell anybody that's listening to this right now about some of the challenges that we're facing. They're pretty significant. And a lot of these challenges are things that we are facing because of the way we're doing things the way we've always done them. And what I'd like to challenge you to think about is this idea that we are not going to be able to solve our critical challenges by doing things the way that we've always done them. We need to start to rethink. So I know this is a webinar, there's no interaction in that sense, but I'm going to ask you to do just a quick little activity of crossing your arms. So just kind of cross your arms and think about how that feels. Does it feel comfortable? Does it feel closed off? Is it, just think a little bit about how that feels to you. All right, and then shake them off. And now cross your arms again, but do it the opposite way. So if you did right over left before, do left over right, or vice versa. And think about how that feels. Does it feel different? Does it feel, some people say it feels a little uncomfortable, or it took them longer to get to there. You can go ahead and shake them off. So doing things the way that we've always done them is comfortable, it's quick, we know how to do it, we can keep going. But those are also some of the strategies that created that, are also creating some of these problems that I flashed up before. So changing the way we think, doing things in different ways, is going to be uncomfortable, and it's probably going to take a little bit longer. But in the process of that, hopefully we can start to challenge the way that our assumptions, and start to think in different ways. And what I'd like to challenge you to think about is how we can learn from nature to solve some of these critical challenges that we face. So we could start to ask ourselves, what would nature do? How would nature solve this challenge? And how can we learn from nature as a mentor, a person, an entity, someone that we can learn from? So how would nature source materials? Birds are able to gather up all the materials to make their nests using found materials, everything that they can find. I have a construction site next to my house, and last spring, there was a robin's nest that was made of, there was some plastic on the bottom, which I thought was very ingenious of this robin, but it was using found materials, right? So how can we start to rethink how we purchase our materials to make things? How does nature slow water flow? How do we think about, on our roofs, we send all of our water to go really far and really fast and just kind of get it away as quickly as possible. But forests will take that water, and the top trees will break it apart and will slow down. It'll hit an understory tree, it'll break apart and slow down. So by the time it reaches the soil, it is slow and more readily absorbed by the soil. So how can we start to rethink how we handle rainwater on a project site? How does nature regulate temperature? I love looking at the bison all covered in snow, and just knowing now that I know that the bison is so well insulated that the sun will actually melt the snowflakes off the surface of the bison before the body heat of the bison will actually do that. And a lot of that has to do with their thick, kind of movable, or they're replaceable. They've got that replaceable layers. So they've got that, the guard hairs on top, and then they've also got this kind of thick mat of insulation below that is shed in the spring. So that's not how we insulate our buildings. But could we start to think about removable layers of insulation? Also, they kind of move themselves around to sort of face into the sun, to the really strong winter winds, and their body shape actually allows for that wind to pass over. So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about how nature regulates temperature. I guess I should have said I'm an architect. I was trained and I worked as an architect for 10 years. So a lot of the things that I think about are how, nature and how that would all impact our built environment. Also, how does nature grow food? This is a huge challenge that we're facing. And our prairies, our native prairies, have these deep roots, and they grow in this perennial polyculture so that they come back every year, and they're always grown in different mixes, so that if there's a wet season, certain plants will grow, and then if it's a dry season, other plants will grow. But that seed bank allows for that resilience and it being able to feed the hundreds of species that live on these sites. How does nature share resources? This is one of my favorites. This is a mycorrhizal fungi. And they're just these amazing, that whenever we think about mushrooms, we think about the fruiting body that's above the soil. But there's these, layers of filaments and webs that could be as large as cities. They're just enormous. And they live in this symbiosis with the plants. And so that the filaments are smaller, and they're able to access some nutrients that the plant roots, which are larger, wouldn't be able to access. And then they're able to sort of puncture into or kind of live around those plant roots, take a little bit of the sugar that the plants make, and in exchange, they'll give the plants these nutrients. And they also aid communication between plant species. So you could have trees on opposite sides of a field, and they wouldn't necessarily, their roots would never touch each other, but they're able to share through chemical communication, through these mycorrhizal networks. If one of the trees starts to get predated on and building up its chemical defenses, a lot of the other trees around it will start doing the same because they're connected via these mycorrhizal networks. Some people have termed it the World Wood Web. So very, very interesting things on how we can learn from nature to understand collaboration better. So really, when I talk about biomimicry and learning from nature, I'm talking about building bridges between people that don't always talk to each other. Having designers and innovators and people that work in technology be able to communicate with people that work in ecology, nature, having life, using kind of function as that bridge, you're able to build communication and build bridges between these different divergent ideas, and then you're able to come up with these more interesting, or at least very different kind of ways of thinking about things. So this is not something that's new. Humans have been learning from nature, everything from people, tribes that used to follow different animals and learn how to hunt, to the Corinthian columns on Greek architecture. We've always sort of looked at nature and tried to learn from her. And then this is actually an example from 70 years ago. Most of you have used this product at some point in your life, and it was actually inspired by a French inventor who, after his dog had run through a prairie and come back completely covered in all these burrs, he was aggravated, but he also wanted to say, okay, well, what exactly is going on here? How is this working? How is this plant seed able to attach to my dog? And he kind of looked inside and he saw that there were these little loops. He got in a microscope and saw that there were these little loops, and developed this technology called Velcro, which is kind of a combination of two French words that mean attach, or hook and loop. So they're able to come up with this attachment technology. And I always, whenever we talk to kids, I always like to bring this, this example at the forefront, because it's something that they've used in their everyday life. It helps them, kids and people with mobility challenges. This is a great product for them to be able to have some independence. It's not necessarily the most sustainable technology because it is made out of plastic. And one of the things that we would try to do with biomimicry, it's not, the innovation, the emulation, the drawing out the elements of the natural world is really kind of what's fun and exciting about it, but it also is this ability to connect with the natural world and to build in these ethics of sustainability. So all of the products and all the different examples that I'm going to show you now all have kind of those ethics of sustainability attached to it. Not necessarily Velcro, but I do like this one because it does have some sort of equity examples in it as well. So one of the ways that we start to think about how do we do this emulation, how do we think about learning from nature, we look at forms, which is what nature makes, process, how it's made, and system, how do they all fit into the same context. So I'm going to give you a few examples, and yeah, let's get going. So the first one is form. So this is an example of a train that was called the bullet train in Japan. And it had this very rounded, it's called the bullet train, had a very rounded front to the train itself. And there's a lot of tunnels in Japan. And so as this train was pushing through these tunnels, it was pushing all of this air in front of it. And then what do you think happened once it got out of the tunnel? All of that air came out all at once, and it was a boom. They were creating sonic booms. So not only was it energy inefficient, the neighbors were not happy. So they had to go back to the drawing board. The engineer that was in charge of redesigning the engine, the front of the engine, was also a birder. And he was able to know, because of his knowledge, he was able to build that bridge so that the birder, he knew that the kingfisher is a species of bird that hunts, that flies in the air and hunts for fish in the water. So it was able to dive from a low density medium of air to water, which is a high density medium, without creating a ripple or a pressure wave or a sonic boom. So he designed the front of this bullet train to emulate and kind of have that same form as the Kingfisher. And it was able to, not only did the train go faster, it was quieter, and it also did not create the sonic booms, which I'm sure the neighbors were ecstatic about. So there's like the very obvious forms that you can emulate in nature, but then there's also maybe the not so obvious forms, the kind of nanoscale, how things are put together. This is a innovation technology. It's a technology called Sharklet. And it was the inspiration was someone was going through or noticing that there were no barnacles that were attaching to sharks, and they wanted to understand why, because whales have barnacles on them, but sharks do not. And then they realized that the skin of the shark is covered in these dermal denticles, which is teeth. So if you thought that sharks were scary before, realize that they are literally covered in teeth, right? So, but these little denticles had this form that is at the very nano scale. It is jagged, or it's kind of ridged. And so bacteria or anything else would land on it, but not be able to grow and create that film, which is actually really how, from a bacterial perspective, that's how they're able to replicate and cause damage, I guess. So there, it doesn't create the form. So there's no chemicals. The bacteria lands on the skin and then it falls off because it can't attach to it. And so they took that kind of very small scale idea and created a technology that is a surface that inhibits bacterial growth through pattern, no chemicals. So there is no, there's no, antibiotic resistance that could occur from this, because they're not actually trying to kill the bacteria. They're just saying, no, you can't live here. And so this started off in medical devices, and then it went to surfaces. So it's like little screens you can put on things so that surfaces like doorknobs and things that get touched a lot, all the way to a $90 yoga mat. So if anybody would like a $90 yoga mat, you can also get that using this technology. So form is what nature made, process is how it's all made. So how does nature create certain things? And some of that is just understanding the differences between species. And that's an example for this one. So this product was actually inspired by spider webs and how birds don't fly into spider webs. And they started to think, well, what is the difference between bird's eyes and human eyes? So for those of you, many of you know that there's a significant problem with birds flying into glass buildings because they don't see the glass. They think they're flying into what's behind it or to the reflection that it's creating. And there's hundreds of millions of birds that die every year flying into glass buildings. It's really, really is a problem. And so what this company looked at was, what's the difference between the bird eye and the human eye? Well, birds can see ultraviolet light and we can't. And it's very common to have a UV or an ultraviolet kind of coating on windows. And so what they did was they took this coating and had this pattern of almost like a spider web. It's kind of just a little jagged pattern. So the kind of blue thing, the blue kind of image you see on the left, that is what a building would look like to a bird. So they can't swim, they won't fly into it. They see it as something that's an object that they would try to avoid. But to us, what we see is on the right because we don't see UV. So we are able to have, as architects, we like our glass, we like our access to nature, our daylighting, we love all that stuff. And so we're able to have a building, or in this case, a perimeter, and this is an example at a zoo, but you can see straight through it, but the birds won't fly into it. And it was able to reduce bird deaths by over 95%. And then another example of process, a lot of what we're trying to do is decarbonize our materials, decarbonize our buildings. A lot of that is a huge thing in sustainability right now, is trying to get the carbon out of everything that we do. And this is a really great example of a company that was called Calera, and now it's kind of in a couple different, the actual product is in a couple different companies at this point. But it was started out because they knew that the corals were able to build limestone, which is the basis of Portland cement. They're able to we're able to build their skeletons, limestone, pulling minerals and carbon from the water, from the seawater. So they looked at what is a technology that we can develop that will take that carbon from the smokestacks and create building materials out of it. So and then it's used for a lot of different things, but Portland cement, this is a lot of more like the concrete kind of based materials. Portland cement, for those of you that don't know, is the additive that goes into concrete, and it has a huge CO2 footprint. So if you can get that CO2 footprint out of it, concrete looks really, really good. So there was the form, the process, and then the system. And as I mentioned, in a former life, I was an architect. And so I am not necessarily going to be building new buildings, but I do take, we like to take a lot of existing technologies and put them together in new and creative ways. And so I get really excited about biomimicry at a systems level. This is an interesting example called Project Positive Now through Biomimicry 3.8, which are the company that trained me. Janine Benya started it. And what they're doing is trying to quantify and set measurable targets for buildings that are based on the ecosystems in which the building inhabits. So it was started kind of prototyped in Australia with Interface, which is a carpet tile manufacturer. They kind of they use themselves as the prototype for this idea. And they assessed the ecosystem functions, ecosystem services that this particular ecosystem did. So how much carbon did it sequester? How much rainwater did it hold? On down the line of all the different metrics that we're looking at. And then they set those as the targets for that factor and try to figure out how do we start to build buildings that accomplish those same strategies. And then so my network, Biomimicry Chicago, kind of took this idea and said, well, what would that look like in Chicago? I'm an architect, a lot of us, and we were really kind of focused on the built environment kind of thing. And we started to think, well, how can we be inspired by the deep roots of our prairie to build a system and a way of thinking and reframing how we think about the built environment, so that we can have buildings and communities and homes that function as well as the ecosystems they inhabit. Excuse me. So what is that? What do I mean when I say that? We can look at, as I mentioned at the beginning, how are we able to handle rainwater that falls on our roofs? Or instead of taking roofs and gutters and aggregating it and getting it as quickly as possible, off the building and away, how do we start to think about how we break that water down, break it apart and slow it down, so that instead of creating flooding, intermittent drought, erosion, and pollution, we're able to actually stabilize the soil, absorb water, and moderate temperature extremes. And these are things that all of us can do. These are not biomimicry inventions per se. Green infrastructure, I could actually make a case for it. But if you take these kind of kit of parts and start to put them together, you can actually create a system that mimics nature by absorbing the rainwater that falls on the site. So green roofs, permeable streetscapes, rain barrels, TCF will help you get a rain barrel if you're interested in that. How do we start to, if we set the target that we want to absorb the rainwater that falls on site, how do we start to pull all these different things together to accomplish that goal? How do we start to think about carbon and energy in terms of cycles as opposed to just waste, right? Like instead of having a bunch of waste and pollution, how do we start to think about our energy and carbon cycles as related, and how a plant through photosynthesis is able to take energy from the sun, absorb it in the roots as a form of chemical energy, and sequester the carbon that it encounters, so that instead of having urban heat islands and air and water pollution and climate change, we can actually start to have regulated temperatures and be able to harness that energy in a more sustainable way. And some of that is, using renewables. Obviously, a lot of it, if we really want to try to have carbon and energy cycles, we really want to start thinking about how, instead of, how does nature generate energy, or how does nature capture energy? It uses photosynthesis. How does nature not capture energy? It doesn't dig down miles below the surface, pull up fossil sunlight, and burn it. And so the questions that I asked at the beginning, what does nature do? How does nature do it? You can also ask, how does nature not do something? So, and it's also important to think about things in terms of scale. So you can have everything from regional wind to community and building integrated solar, also to decarbonizing your buildings. And so that's one of the things that's kind of the new thing that everyone's trying to talk about is how do we start to get natural gas out of our homes and out of our buildings? And then by pulling kind of these kits of parts and putting them all together at different scales, you're able to create a zero carbon infrastructure, which would be the goal. Biodiversity. Those of you that have been on a lot of our TCF webinars will know that this is kind of a big thing for us, right? We love talking about biodiversity and native landscapes and native plants so that you can move away from the chemical dependent and fragile lawns to a landscape that is adaptive and resilient. So you don't have the chemical dependency, but you can actually not only have beautiful, biodiverse landscapes that not only give us the aesthetics we're looking for, but also provide food and shelter for an amazing array of animals. And again, looking at scales, some of these are some examples from TCF and related organizations, but I also want to call to attention to the one on the left, the Land Institute. It's a great biomimicry story of a group. It's a nonprofit, but they're out in Salina, Kansas. And, he had this whole thing. When I first started into biomimicry, I got really excited about food systems. And I was like, I want to grow wheat on the roofs of buildings. And he was just like, you know what? Let the bread basket handle getting all of the wheat. Why don't you worry about on the buildings, the really kind of perishable fruits, the perishable things like the fruits and the vegetables and things that you want to harvest and then eat as soon as possible. But grains and things that make into our breads and our cereals, those are things that they have a long shelf life. So let the bread basket handle that and then have the other things a little bit more building integrated that have to be eaten right away. So what they did was they looked at this model of looking to the prairie as a example of how to grow food. So instead of having the industrial monoculture that gets planted every year, they are growing a perennial polyculture grain production. So a bunch of different plants all grown together, and they're with the deep roots. And so they're perennial. They will come back every year. And they have a couple different products out there now, and they're still continuing to do it. They're not using GMOs. They're doing, cycles, just regular plant cycles. And but if you really want to kind of do a deep dive into food production from a biomimicry perspective, I would highly recommend looking into the Land Institute. And also, if you just want kind of an overview, Janine's book, Biomimicry, by Janine Benyus, has a whole chapter devoted to this group, and they're phenomenal. But, obviously we don't live on grain alone. We need to have our fruits and vegetables and our organic farm share, like Green Earth Harvest is a really good example of that, all the way to things we can do in our yard. Instead of having the ornamentals, we can have actually beautiful plants that actually produce food for us at the same time. And how does nature recycle materials? Looking at how we handle our material production, getting away from the consumable and disposable to something that's continually renewed and recycled. And there's some really kind of interesting things. I mean, for a couple decades now, industry's been trying to get to this kind of zero waste model. And, you can look at a lot of different scales. I mentioned Calera, the carbon sequestering materials, Interface, the carpet tile manufacturer. They just have great examples for everything they do. They're really on the cutting edge and really sort of pushing the envelope in a lot of ways. And their networks idea was that they make their carpet tile backing, their carpets in general, and carpet tiles out of nylon. And it's a certain kind of nylon. But it's the same nylon that's used in fishing nets. And so what they did was paid local people that were living in these areas that had a lot of these waste fishing nets that would break or get discarded. And then it causes a lot of food chain disruption with the fish. And so they would pay them to harvest them, to clean them, and to sell them back. And then they would make make their carpet tiles out of it. Everything all the way down to buy nothing networks. I'm not sure if anybody's plugged into these buy nothing networks, but they are great. I still have kids that are growing and outgrowing clothes, and you just basically take a picture of what you want to give away, and somebody comes and picks it up, and then they're posting what they don't want, and you might say, oh, I really like that, and then I'll go pick that up. And so it gets away from this idea that you have to purchase everything that you want to use. You can actually find ways to not purchase things. To community resilience. That's the kind of what we're looking to do. We want to look to mycorrhizal fungi. We want to look to these collaborative relationships that are able to, get away from this idea of, that everything is disconnected, to how do we start to get things that are more collaborative. And as I mentioned, I am an architect, but I don't really practice it anymore. But I do a lot of this education kind of thing. But I'm also not a policymaker. I'm not going to be investing in building or investing in different products and things like that. But I am a homeowner. I am a citizen, and I can, I wanted to see what are some things that I can do, just as an everyday person. To look to this, to emulate this idea of, building our deep roots. How do we start to create a system that sets these targets for these different things that we'd like to do, and, work towards those targets by looking to how an ecosystem would perform that. So on the graph on the right, kind of in the middle so you saw the little icons that I had on the presentation, and in the middle is kind of like what the industry standard is, and the outside is what a natural standard would be, like a nature standard. And then I start to set goals, and I say, okay, well, for biodiversity, I'm going to rebuild my landscape to grow perennial edible wildlife enhancing vegetation. And I did. I got my yard certified by Conservation at Home. And for the, you can see I still have a little bit of lawn, but very, very little. And I have a lot of edible shrubs and really native plants. And my backyard especially is just a complete wildlife preserve at this point. It's great. And I live in a very suburban area. So, and you can see that, so I kind of gave myself about an 80% on that. I capture all rainwater on site, still working on that, haven't gotten there yet. I was going to replace my energy with renewable alternatives, and funny story, I was literally a day away from signing the contract and my house got struck by lightning. So that hasn't happened yet, but it will. You could see that actually the thing I'm doing the best at is the robust food composting. I got chickens, and the chickens, and between the 6 chickens and the 2 dogs and a composter, I don't have any food waste. So, there's things that you could do just as an everyday person to start to think about, what are these targets that I'd like? I'd like to absorb all the rainwater on site. I'd like to get rid of all of my food waste. Right? I can't say that, I can change my purchasing decisions, but I'm not in charge of what happens at an industrial level, but I am in charge of what happens at my level. And so you could say this, I started this about 4 years ago. I've got a few more years until, I got to get my solar panels up, and I got to figure out my rainwater system, but I have a plan for it, but I can't do everything all at once, and neither can anybody else. And so we just kind of set a plan, set a goal, and see what you can accomplish. So these are all things that you could do. You could take these kind of kits of parts and start to think of your home or your business or whatever context you're looking at as a system, and start to pull from all of these different ideas so that you can start to have a system that really does embody nature at this kind of deeper level. One of the things that Jamie's going to put in the chat is I just created this little worksheet, and you can kind of pull it up, download it, print it, and if you want to start to think about what this looks like for you, and you have my information from the front, and it'll be again at the end. So take a look, and I'd love to see what you think is what you can do. And if you don't, you're not ready to do that, or you don't live in a place that you have a lot of control over what you can do, this just this idea of reconnection. We talked about how biomimicry is about emulating nature. It's also about the ethics of sustainability, but it's also about this reconnection, about reconnecting with the natural world, especially if we live in cities and, more developed areas. Sometimes we start to think about nature as out there. It's not me. It's not my yard. It's not my family. It's somewhere else, right? And it's not, because we're all nature. And so how do we start to reconnect with those aspects? This is a great website. It was developed right in the beginning of the pandemic. People were just looking for something to do. But I pulled a couple of them here, but you could just go to that website, and it's, just do some journal entries and, share with me what you like. So we kind of, a little bit of that was heady, right? Like a lot of that was, talking about metrics and things like that. And that's really, really important. But it's also important to kind of think about how we can start to emulate life at its deepest level, so that in the process of meeting our own needs, we actually create the conditions that others are able to meet their needs. So creating conditions conducive to life. So if we can kind of keep that in our heads of how do we create the conditions that future generations are going to be able to enjoy the natural world as much as we do. And you can learn from nature. So thank you very much. This is my contact information, and I'd love to hear from anyone if you have questions, or if you, whatever you want to do.
Thanks, Amy. That was awesome. So I really love some of these examples of things, because, who would have thought, birds and putting spider webs effectively into the glass to help prevent bird strikes. I mean, having done several bird watching webinars, that's always one of the big questions is, how do we prevent bird strikes? Because nobody likes to come outside and see, a bird outside that hit their window, and it's always very sad. And how do we prevent it? Well, we've got these little window clings you can put on there, but man, it's not practical for like the big tall skyscrapers and things like that. So having a product that can prevent that, and having that already in the glass, like that to me is just so awesome. And then the other examples, like the bullet train, based off of a kingfisher's face, right? I mean, like, nature has found all these solutions already, and all we got to do is look for them. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So I find the topic very interesting, and so I appreciate your presentation on all of that, as well as all of the the background and the reasoning for it all too, right? So yeah, that was awesome. So does anybody have any questions? I was looking in the chat here. I haven't seen any so far, but wanted to see. Nothing there. All right. Well, I put the link to that worksheet that you gave me. I did put that in the chat. So for those of you who are interested in seeing how you fit into the whole plan, there you go. Oh, I just saw some questions pop up. So, oh, Nikki wants to know about getting rain barrels. I will go ahead and take that. So through the Conservation Foundation, we do offer rain barrels, and they're really awesome because they are repurposed barrels. So once again, reduce, reuse, recycle. And you can, when you close out of this webinar, there will be a link on our website, or a page from our website will be up there, and there will be information on there about rain barrels for you. Otherwise, you can check out our website, theconservationfoundation.org, and find the tab for rain barrels there, and you can order. They can either be delivered to your house for a delivery fee, or you can pick them up at our farm. I should also note that if you are in our region, many local municipalities and organizations are having rain barrel sales as well. Locally, I know there's going to be one in Joliet. There's going to be another one for the Manhattan Park District. Wheaton, I think, usually has one. So you can also check with your local municipality for rain barrel sales near you. If you can't find one, let me know and I will get you information. All right, Christy wants to know, out of the different areas, composting, rainwater capture, etc., is there an area you found people have a challenge working with?
I mean, it sort of depends on the really important thing is that you find your local resources, right? Because a lot of some people will be challenged with, for me personally, I have a challenge of, I have rain barrels, but I've had issues with ice dams coming down whenever I've attached them to my rain barrel. So I know the organization, I work for the organization, I just have to have somebody help me figure out, what is it that's causing this ice dam to happen and how do I prevent it? Some people have, a lot of it's a learning curve too, right? So, once I first started composting and I did the worm composting in my house, Not a great idea because it likes to attract fruit flies, and then the fruit flies are everywhere. So I learned to move it up to my garage. So a lot of it's just really connecting with that resource of people that have done it before. And sometimes that's Facebook groups, and sometimes that's calling Jamie and the other people at the Conservation Foundation and calling Jim at the Conservation at Home and saying, why is my plant dying? What is going on here? So it's really about connecting yourself, like I talked about with the mycorrhizal fungi. How do you start to connect yourself with these resources so that they can help you and then you can help them in return?
So I will say I do keep my worm bin in my basement, and I have for many, many years. And it's all about finding that homeostasis in your bin that prevents the fruit flies from coming in. It doesn't completely solve it always. I know, we just started a new bin and we're working on getting it to that point, but it is possible to keep worm bins in the house and not have bug issues. I just want to point that out. Me personally, I mean, energy is always an issue for me because I am not a cold weather girl, but coming to that median temperature where my husband is happy and so am I, and and we're not going crazy. Plus we keep turtles, which means they have lights on and heaters and things. So energy is a particular issue in my house, but we're looking at community solar, waiting for that community solar farm to get under operation that we signed up
Yeah,
with.
and as I
So
said, I mean, Illinois especially has a bunch of different incentives that are out there to try to get solar panels. And
absolutely.
I mean, I looked at my back roof and I'm like, there's no way that I'll be able to. And somebody just did, the person that I was going to buy them from, they just put everything together, and I could have done my entire energy usage just using solar on a fairly small roof. And so it was great. It got struck by lightning. So, and then I realized it's an old roof that needs to be repaired before I get before I put solar
Yeah.
panels on it. So let's get a new roof and then we'll do it. But yeah, all of these things are achievable. It's just thinking about it, but also realizing that there's some things you can do right now and some things you're going to have to budget for and plan for.
So Amy wants to know, have you seen any solutions to plastics from biomimicry?
Yes, there are. And I am not one of those people that is capable of keeping a lot of names on the top of my head. But Amy, if you have my email, if you want to just go ahead and email me, I will look it up and I will put it back. I will also say that if you go to asknature.org, ASKNATURE. It's a really, really great resource for functional biology. So they have a lot of these biomimicry examples. They also, you can type in, composting or something. You could type in any sort of topic and get some really kind of neat examples and neat strategies to see how it's functional biology. It's how nature works. So even just kind of going through and perusing is also a really fun website to do. But I know that they do have some bioplastics that are kind of the same idea as the Calera concrete project that I mentioned, that they take the carbon from waste stacks and convert that into plastics, because that's what plastic is, right? It's carbon.
So we did actually have a webinar a few weeks ago with the Shed Aquarium where we talked about combating plastics pollution. So that might be something that you could check out that webinar as well. I mentioned in that one that so I just started getting my vitamins through this company called Care of, and the vitamins come in a little package per day. And I noticed I was reading through their material because I was like, ooh, more waste. It's actually a sugar-based plastic that can supposedly go in your home compost. So a lot of those supposedly compostable plastics you need to have an industrial composter for. So it's got to go to some municipal type composter in order to work. This one claims it can work in your home composter. So I've, for the last month or two, have been throwing my little plastic packages in there. And so we'll see if they truly do get broken down either by my worms or in my backyard composter. So
Well,
we'll
and
see.
also there's, I forget, is it Paul Stamets? There's one of the famous mycologists is talking about the different kinds of mushrooms that will actually break down plastics, even not just the
Oh, yeah,
compostable
yeah.
plastics, but the actual plastic that you would get like your grocery bags. So there, I think one of the questions was, there is any way to do the compostable plastics at home, which this isn't at home, but there eventually it will get broken down, but there are ways to accelerate it by using fungi.
Yeah, generally those compostable plastics, they need a much higher temperature than your home composter will get. So there really isn't a way to get them to break down. I know we had some like corn plastics, they were called, when I worked for the Forest Preserve District. We had some silverware that was made out of these corn plastics, and you know, fun fact, stabbing it into something that's really hot, you know, putting your fork in there will cause the tines to just kind of curl up. They're not great, but you know, they claim to be compostable, but it was one of those that needs that high temperature to get all of that to break down. So
But I think this is also just a really important showcase of how it's all about systems. It's all
exactly.
about connecting into those systems. You don't have to do, I don't have to be an expert on how to change, you know, to fix my car, but
Right.
I know people that do. I don't know, I don't have to compost everything at home, but if I know that I purchased the right products and then I send it to the right place, then I know that it's getting taken care of. So, you know, building in that home, that your home ecosystem that's attached to the larger community ecosystem that's attached to the larger global ecosystem.
And as a follow-up question, Nikki wants to know if you're better off burning that compostable plastic. I would think not. I don't know enough about it to know if it's going to give off any kind of like weird chemical off gassing or something like that. So
In general,
I
I
would,
burning things.
yeah, I would generally say not on that. So anyway, Maura wants to know, our friend Maura, where you can purchase windows locally that use bird resistant glass.
I know there are them. I don't know the name off the top of my head, but the company was called Ornalux, and it was bird glass, but it was called Ornalux, and it was developed in Germany. But I know that they have local distributors. I will say it's fairly expensive still. At least the last time I checked, it was. So hopefully, it's one of those things that the more it's called for, the more that they do it. Supply and demand will start to get some of that products get it a little bit cheaper. But I know that they do have US distribution.
And I know I've seen more about it since learning about it a few years back. I know I have come across it as a solution in more places. So hopefully that means it's going to be coming out again. Amy, would you throw your email up on the screen again?
Sure.
Thanks. And while you're doing that, Annette says, I think you mentioned your two dogs contributed to helping reduce your waste. Wondering how? I'm assuming
It's
that means you give them
mostly,
table
oops,
scraps.
sorry, don't do that. Yeah, it's mostly that. Well, you know, you're not supposed to give your dogs your table scraps, but let's say it's not always practiced at my house. But no, I mean, it's mostly the chickens. We have a little compost bucket on our cabinet and or our, you know, kitchen cabinet, and then we just throw everything in there. I throw it out to the chickens, but again, whatever the chicken, I do have a bit of menagerie back there, so I know that I've got all sorts of animals that are coming into my backyard, which I'm fine with because we love the birds and the bunnies and all of that. The skunks, not so much. But you know, we just kind of put it out there, and then you know the chickens eat it up, and then sometimes whenever what the chickens don't finish, my dogs go out and finish. But I try to beat them to it because I don't want them eating all of that. So then I throw that in the
Right.
composter.
Yeah. Luann says, unfortunately joined late. She'd be interested in knowing what was the most challenging and how you addressed it. So we did talk a little bit about the rain barrels and some issues that you've had there. But she's also interested in learning more about fungi.
Okay.
What
Well,
what
I would recommend any of the books by Paul Stamets. That's a court, you know, for any sort of, like, he's got a book called, you know, 150 ways or 1,000 ways mushrooms are going to save the world. I think that the things about fungi are just absolutely fascinating. I feel like we're just scratching the surface and understanding how they work. You know, and I think the other thing is, like, you know, I talked about how all these things fit into the larger system, but I think also sometimes it's just hard for people to think about themselves in terms of the decisions I make actually are a form of design, and I can create the world I live in by these choices that I make. And you know, so sometimes you know, they think I'm not an innovator, I'm not an inventor. You know, how does this help me? And so that's why I kind of, you know, have the end of the presentation really like, you can actually do this. But sometimes that is kind of a, you know, people have these stories about themselves that they live in their head. And you know, all of us have a capability of making decisions and kind of reframing the way we think about things. And if we start to think about how nature solves challenges, we can start to embody some of that and come up with new and creative ways to accomplish those goals.
fantastic. Jackie's reminding everybody that there is a place called Collective Resource Compost in Evanston that does industrial composting. And this is one of those cases where, you know, as a citizen, talk to your elected officials. There was, I want to say, Forest Park. There's one of the suburbs that is north of me, but then again, aren't they all? That because their trash contract was coming due, their elected officials actually managed to negotiate in compost pickup, home compost collection that would go to a municipal composting place. And because they were able to get that added into their trash compact or contract, now the whole town has access to composting. And it's a really cool program. What's that?
Was that Gray's Lake?
It was not Gray's Lake.
Because I know they have a similar thing up there.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly which suburb it was. I heard some of the municipal folks there talk about the program they had, and it was really cool. And I mean, it was effectively just like your recycling pickup, only for compost. And they had, you know, neighbors were sharing so that they could, you know, save on cost on that. So, you know, if one person couldn't fill up their whole bin, like a neighbor, they would sort of share it together to share the cost, and that was totally fine. Judas is Oak Park. That's where that's the one I was thinking of. It was Oak Park. I knew it was something park. But Jackie says Lake Zurich and Libertyville also has composting through waste management. And Christy says also that in Lisle too. So it's apparently becoming a little more widespread, but you have to let your elected officials know that this is the kind of thing that you're interested in. If they don't know we're interested, they're not going to do it. But the more people they have asking them about it and pressuring them and quite honestly, sometimes even just suggesting it because they don't know that it's a thing that may not be their area of expertise. Just letting them know that that's the kind of thing you're interested in, you know, then we'll have that more widespread for everybody. Allison says, I would love to see a more robust composting program in Naperville. My parents in Austin can compost anything that's food-based, even citrus, meat, onions, paper towels that you use to wipe your counters. If I'm elected to Naperville City Council, this is something I want to do. Fantastic. Best of luck to you, Allison, because that would be awesome to see as well. Annette wants to know, are you aware of any door handles we can purchase that use the Sharklet coatings?
It's not actually the handle itself. It is a kind of like a film that you put on it. So a lot of times you'll see those in those bar, you know, like the bars for the push doors, like in hospitals. That's where they're typically used. But it is just sort of a film that you put on it, and that's how it works. But yeah, I believe it. I mean, Sharklets, they're pretty widely distributed at this point. So they've got, you know, the yoga mat thing cracked me up.
Yeah, that is,
like,
that
I
is
like
interesting.
the idea of a $90 for a yoga mat's a little steep.
All right, let's see. All right. Well, I think that's about all of the questions that I'm seeing here. All right. Well, this has been really awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day today to talk to us about this, which is something that I know you are particularly passionate about. So it's always fun hearing people who are passionate about something talk about their passions. So again, thank you so much. And if anybody has any questions, that email that you got from Zoom's got my email address in it. I can always put you in touch with Amy if you missed her email address there, or if you mistype it or whatever. I can always help you with that too. And if you have questions about rain barrels, rain gardens, any of that, let me know. Check out our YouTube channel for other webinars on composting and things like that. And with that, I think we're going to wrap up for the day. So once again, thank you to Amy. Thank you to all of you for attending today. Thank you to our sponsors. And I will see you all back here next week when we talk to Chris Benda about some really awesome places here in Illinois. So thanks, everybody. Take care. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.